Hey guys, we're coming now to the last part of chapter 9 in teaching our young people, and we're coming to three aspects. We're just about to finish the Old Testament, so we're coming to Judges, Kings, and Prophets. And what I would like to pick the story up from is the time when Moses is leading the people of God towards the promised land. However, because of the disobedience, they have to spend 40 years in the wilderness, just kind of moving around from place to place. Moses dies, and then Joshua takes over. He finally brings them into the promised land. And the interesting fact that I would probably prefer to mention at this point is that the people of Israel followed God during Moses' time, during Joshua's time, during Caleb's time. But the moment the leadership, the spiritual leadership of the people was no longer of the same depth and quality, they started to drift away. As a result of that, God would have allowed them to be controlled by the neighboring nations. Once Joshua brought them into the promised land, the land was divided in 12 parts, according to the 12 tribes of Israel. God commanded them to conquer the land and take possession of it, but some of them failed to do so. So every time God had to discipline them, he used the neighboring nations to come and oppress them. And so now we have a cycle of 300 years during Judges, where the people of God would have been disciplined by God at the hand of the other nations. Then they would have prayed. God would have raised a judge to rule over them, to lead them, to bring them back to God. And then that judge would die. Then they will lose their way. Then another nation will come to conquer them. Then they will cry to God. Then another judge would rise. So we've got judges like Gideon, Samson, Deborah, and other people like that. Obviously, Samuel is the last of the judges, and at that time, the people of God come to Samuel and says that your sons are not following God. Therefore, we want to have a king like all the other nations, a king that would allow us to give a name for ourselves. So Samuel is forced to go to God and arrange for a king to be set. Saul becomes the first king, but God rejects him. Then David comes on the scene. David is a man after God's own heart. David is not just a king, but also a prophet. Whenever we are talking about the prophets, we understand that in a sense all these prophets that God gives to Israel are persecuted, are killed. David is also a king and a prophet, and he's known for his desire to build a house for God. We can link that to the tabernacle. That is still maintained as a tent. David comes with this desire in his heart to build a house, a proper temple for God, but God doesn't allow him. It is his son Solomon that builds the temple. But it's an interesting fact that I would also like to mention that is not in the book. God divides the kingdom because Solomon's heart was divided. So direct consequences of Solomon's heart as a king, God divides the nation. And after Solomon, the nation is broken in two. The northern kingdom becomes Israel. The southern kingdom becomes Judah. There are 10 tribes in Israel. There are 2 tribes in Judah. And this is where we come into the age of the prophets. The prophets were chosen by God from either shepherds to priests and people that had no particular trade or job, to bring a message of conviction of sin or of judgment. That was the 2 main aspects of being a prophet. And because of that, prophets were not liked, as you could imagine. People didn't like to be told what to do. They would have preferred to go to false prophets that gave them a sense of false security. Therefore, the prophets were persecuted and killed. So then I come to the stage where God has had enough with them. And in 722 BC, the Assyrian kingdom comes and conquers the northern kingdom of Israel and takes them into captivity. 200 years later, around 200 years later, 586 BC, Babylon, the Babylonians come and they take Judah into captivity after repeated warnings from God about their sin. When the tribe of Judah goes into captivity, they're known as Jews from the tribe of Judah. The exile lasts about 70 years, and they slowly return as God has promised. And we have the period of Nehemiah and Ezra and Esther. Then another period that is interesting is the blank page between the Old Testament and the New Testament. This is the blank page between the Old Testament represents 400 years of silence, where the people of Israel are influenced by two major empires, the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire. The Greeks have a great influence because this is where the society in Israel separates in religious groups. We have the Sadducees that have a great political input into social life. They are sort of taking out from God's law, and they're removing what is uncomfortable to them. Then we have the formation of the Pharisees, which are a very strict religious sect that is not taking out but is adding a lot of tradition, a lot of human-made rules to the ones that God has already given. Then we have the group of the scribes that are in charge of copying all these laws and traditions. These are the three groups of people that Jesus would be dealing with in the New Testament, specifically in the Gospels. Then we have the situation under the Romans. The Greeks, under the Greeks, the Jews have constantly rebelled. Then we have the revolt under the Maccabees. You find those into the Apocrypha, which are a selection of historical books that are not in the Protestant Bible because they're not considered of divine inspiration. They're just historical sources. I recommend you read the Apocrypha. It's very good. Under the Romans' rule, we have the introduction of the Pax Romana, which is the Roman peace that allowed you to profess, to keep your religion as long as you pay taxes, you didn't rebel, and in a sense, each governor or king over a region would be allowed to raise his own taxes as long as he paid Rome. That kept the empire at peace, kept everybody happy. However, there's still a lot of struggle. This is where Herod the Great comes, who is a fantastic man in terms of buildings. He builds the temple, extends it, and makes it even bigger and greater. So in a sense, now we are 2,000 years after Abraham received the promise of a deliverer. And I want to sort of finish with this sense of anticipation, this sense of expectation. Messiah could come anytime. He will be introduced to the nation. It's interesting that now we're coming close to Christmas. This is going to be a good time to introduce the birth of Jesus and the meaning of that. So if anybody is doing the teaching, these are some of the pointers that you could use. There's no specific text that you could use. There's a lot of history. You could use Isaiah 29, but this is very much an introduction to the birth of Jesus, which is going to lead us into the next bit. Again, the emphasis is this expectation, this time of waiting. When is Messiah going to come? Having their own expectation of how that would look like and how he would arrive and how he would save them. And then surprise, Messiah comes in the most unexpected way they could ever imagine. So that's the rest of chapter 9 for us to teach on Friday, and I'll see you soon.